The Catholic priest's intestines were pulled from his body while he was still alive, watching as they burned before his eyes. On December 1st, 1581, Edmund Campion experienced one of the most savage forms of execution ever devised by human imagination. They dragged him through the muddy streets of London to Tyburn, where crowds gathered to witness what the English government called justice but what we'd recognize today as state-sanctioned torture. You've heard about religious persecution. You've read about martyrs dying for their faith. But nothing you've learned in school prepares you for the raw brutality of what happened to Catholics under Elizabeth I's reign. This wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit before destroying the body. Edmund Campion's crime: being a Catholic priest in Protestant England. That's it. No plots against the crown, no armies raised in rebellion, just a man who refused to abandon his faith when the state demanded it. And for that they tore him apart piece by piece while he was still breathing. The method they used, hanging, drawing, and quartering, makes modern forms of capital punishment look merciful by comparison. First, they hanged him until he was almost dead, cutting him down while he could still feel everything. Then came the disembowelment. Picture having your abdomen sliced open and your organs removed one by one while you're conscious enough to watch. The executioner would hold up each piece to the cheering crowd before tossing it into the fire. Only after this prolonged agony would they finally behead the victim and chop the body into quarters. This is the story they don't tell you about the golden age of Elizabethan England. Behind the poetry and plays, behind the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the rise of English power, there was a systematic campaign of religious terror that claimed hundreds of lives. Edmund Campion's execution wasn't an isolated incident. It was government policy. What makes Campion's story particularly haunting is how ordinary his life began. He wasn't born a revolutionary or raised as a militant. He was a brilliant scholar who simply followed his conscience in an age when that could get you butchered in public. His journey from respected academic to hunted priest reveals the human cost of religious intolerance at its most extreme. The crowds who watched his execution that December morning expected to see a traitor die. What they witnessed instead was something that shook even hardened observers. A man who faced unimaginable torture with such composure that some began to question whether they were watching justice or murder. Eyewitnesses recorded details that still disturb historians today, accounts of suffering so intense that reading them feels like peering into humanity's darkest capabilities. This is Edmund Campion's story, stripped of the sanitized versions you find in textbooks. It's a window into an era when faith could literally tear you apart, when choosing the wrong church meant choosing death by torture. And it all started with a religious revolution that turned neighbor against neighbor, transforming England into a surveillance state where Catholic priests were hunted like animals. England in 1581 wasn't the merry realm of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth that popular culture loves to romanticize. For Catholics, it was a police state where practicing your faith could lead to the scaffold. The roots of this persecution stretched back decades, to when Henry VIII shattered England's thousand-year connection to Rome because he wanted a new wife. But under Elizabeth, religious oppression evolved into something far more sinister: a coordinated system of surveillance, betrayal, and savage punishment. The government didn't just ban Catholic worship, they made it high treason. Harboring a priest could get your entire family executed. Attending Mass meant risking financial ruin, imprisonment, or worse. Special priest hunters prowled the countryside, searching for hidden chapels and secret Catholics. They offered massive rewards for information. 30 pieces of silver had nothing on what Elizabeth's agents would pay for a captured priest. Catholic families built elaborate hiding places in their homes, priest holes, they called them. These weren't simple closets but architectural marvels of deception. False walls, hidden passages behind fireplaces, spaces between floors where a man could hide for days while government agents tore the house apart searching for him. Some priests died in these cramped spaces, suffocating silently rather than emerging to face torture. The paranoia was suffocating. Your own servants might be government informers. Your children could be taken away and raised Protestant. Even possessing Catholic books or rosary beads marked you as a potential traitor. The state created an atmosphere where Catholics lived in constant fear, never knowing when that knock on the door would come. Elizabeth's government justified this brutality through propaganda that would impress modern dictatorships. They portrayed every Catholic as a potential assassin, every priest as a foreign agent. Parliament passed law after law tightening the noose. First fines for missing Protestant services, then imprisonment, then death. They called it protecting England from papal tyranny, but it looked more like creating tyranny of their own. The Queen's chief spymaster, Francis Walsingham, built a network that reached into every corner of English life. His agents infiltrated Catholic communities, posed as sympathizers, even pretended to be priests to trap believers. They intercepted letters, decoded secret messages, and maintained files on thousands of suspected Catholics. This wasn't medieval superstition, this was systematic, bureaucratic persecution with all the efficiency the Tudor state could muster. Protestant preachers thundered from pulpits about the Catholic menace. Pamphlets flooded the streets describing lurid Catholic plots, most of them complete fabrications. The government staged show trials where tortured priests confessed to treasons they'd never committed. Public opinion was carefully managed to ensure that when men like Edmund Campion went to their deaths, the crowds would cheer rather than protest. The human cost was staggering. Families were torn apart as some members conformed to save themselves while others held to the old faith. Children informed on parents. Husbands betrayed wives. The social fabric of entire communities unraveled as suspicion replaced trust. What the government feared most weren't Catholic armies or Spanish invasions. They feared men like Edmund Campion, educated, articulate priests who could remind people that there was an alternative to the state church. These weren't foreign insurgents but Englishmen who'd given up everything for their faith. They threatened the government's monopoly on religious truth, and for that they had to die. But not just die, they had to die so horribly that others would abandon their faith rather than risk the same fate. In the bustling streets of London, 1540, a merchant's son entered the world just as England was tearing itself apart over faith. Edmund Campion's birth coincided with one of history's greatest religious upheavals. Henry VIII had shattered England's ancient ties to Rome barely 6 years earlier, and the country was still reeling from the aftershocks. The London of Campion's childhood was a city of contradictions. Monastery bells that had rung for centuries fell silent as Henry's men stripped lead from their roofs and sold off their stones. Catholic priests who'd once walked openly now skulked in shadows, while new Protestant ministers took their pulpits. Young Edmund grew up watching neighbors whisper about which prayers were safe to say, which beliefs could get you burned at the stake. His father ran a bookshop, surrounding the boy with ideas during an age when ideas could kill you. The Champions weren't nobility, they were middle-class Londoners trying to navigate the religious chaos without losing their heads. They did what millions of English families did, kept their heads down, attended the required services, and hoped the religious winds would stop shifting. But Edmund was different. Teachers noticed his exceptional memory, his gift for languages, his ability to craft arguments that left grown men speechless. By age 13, he'd mastered Latin so thoroughly that Oxford University offered him a scholarship. His parents must have felt that mixture of pride and terror that comes from raising a brilliant child in dangerous times. At Oxford, Campion flourished like a plant finally given sunlight. He devoured classical texts, excelled in rhetoric, and became such a celebrated orator that when Queen Mary visited in 1553, they chose him to deliver the welcoming speech. The teenage scholar impressed the Catholic Queen so thoroughly that she became his patron. For a brief moment it seemed his future was assured. Then Mary died. Elizabeth took the throne and England's religious compass spun again. Suddenly, being a Catholic queen's favorite was a liability, not an asset. Campion did what ambitious young men do when the political winds shift. He adapted. He took the oath of supremacy, acknowledging Elizabeth as head of the English Church. He wore the Protestant mask that survival demanded. But something gnawed at him. The more he studied, the more the contradictions tormented him. How could the church founded by Christ have so many different versions? Why should English Christianity bend to royal matrimonial needs? His Protestant colleagues noticed his doubts, the way he'd fall silent during theological debates, the questions he stopped asking aloud. The breaking point came during a ceremony where he had to publicly affirm Protestant doctrine. Standing before the assembly, the words stuck in his throat. He mumbled through the oath, but in June 1580, Edmund Campion stepped off a small merchant vessel onto English soil, knowing that every breath he took from that moment forward could be his last. The 39-year-old Jesuit priest had just committed what amounted to signing his own death warrant. Returning to England as a Catholic priest wasn't illegal, it was punishable by death. The England Campion returned to had transformed into a surveillance state that would make modern dictatorships take notes. Elizabeth I's government had constructed an intricate web of spies, informants, and priest hunters whose sole purpose was tracking down Catholic clergy. These weren't amateur bounty hunters. We're talking about professional manhunters who studied Catholic rituals, learned secret codes, and could spot a disguised priest by the way he held his hands during conversation. Campion traveled under the alias of a jewel merchant named Edmunds. His actual mission was far more dangerous than smuggling gems. He carried with him portable altars, sacred oils, and communion wafers, items that in Protestant England were considered more treasonous than gunpowder. Each Catholic home he visited became a potential trap. Wealthy Catholic families would hide priests in specially constructed priest holes, hidden compartments behind walls, under floorboards, inside chimneys. Some of these hiding spots were so cramped that priests would emerge after days unable to walk, their limbs seized from maintaining impossible positions. The psychological toll was crushing. Campion couldn't simply walk into a church and hold Mass. Every sacrament had to be performed in secret, often in the dead of night. Babies were baptized in hushed ceremonies while lookouts watched for approaching authorities. Confessions were whispered in attics and cellars. Marriage ceremonies took place with escape routes planned and horses saddled outside. One wrong move, one careless word overheard by the wrong person, and everyone present faced imprisonment, torture, or death. Yet Campion didn't just hide. He engaged in what the government considered even more dangerous activities, he wrote. His most famous work, later dubbed Campion's Brag, was a direct challenge to the Protestant establishment. In it he declared his mission was purely spiritual, not political. He wasn't there to assassinate the Queen or incite rebellion. He came to save souls. The government saw this distinction as meaningless. To them, every Catholic convert was a potential traitor, every Mass a conspiracy meeting. For over a year, Campion moved through England like a ghost. He traveled at night, changed his appearance frequently, never stayed in one place more than a few days. Reports from the time describe him preaching to crowds of hundreds in barns and private homes, always one step ahead of the authorities. His reputation grew so large that Protestant ministers were forced to publicly debate his arguments, even in his absence. The manhunt intensified. The government offered rewards that would set up informants for life. Catholic homes were raided without warning. Suspected priest harbors were tortured until they revealed their guests. Campion knew the walls were closing in. In his letters he wrote about expecting arrest daily, about making peace with his inevitable fate, yet he continued his ministry, driven by a conviction that frightened the Protestant establishment more than any army could have. The summer of 1581 brought the breakthrough Elizabeth's agents had been praying for. A Catholic informant, possibly under torture or motivated by the substantial reward money, revealed intelligence about Campion's movements. The priest was staying at Layford Grange in Berkshire, the home of a Catholic family named Yate. What should have been another brief stop on Campion's endless journey became the trap that would seal his fate. On July 17, 1581, a force of armed men surrounded Layford Grange. The raid was methodical, professional. They knew about priest holes. These weren't local constables making a routine check. These were specialists who understood Catholic architecture better than many Catholics. They measured rooms, looking for discrepancies. They tapped walls, listening for hollow sounds. They studied chimneys, checked dimensions against external structures. The search lasted hours. Campion and two companions huddled in a priest hole so tight they could barely breathe. The space was designed for one person to hide for maybe an hour. 3 men cramped inside for over a day tested human endurance. No food, no water, no ability to move. The heat was suffocating. Below them they could hear the searchers destroying furniture, ripping apart floorboards. Then came the mistake that ended everything. A piece of plaster fell from their hiding spot. Just a small chunk, probably no bigger than a coin. But it was enough. Within minutes, the searchers had found the entrance. Campion emerged, dignified despite his ordeal, his legs barely able to support him after the cramped confinement. The journey to London turned into a public spectacle. The authorities wanted everyone to see the captured priest. They tied Campion's feet together under his horse's belly, pinned a paper to his hat reading Campion, the seditious Jesuit. Crowds gathered in every town they passed through. Some came to mock, others to secretly pray. Campion maintained his composure throughout, even engaging his captors in theological debates during rest stops. His trial began on November 20, 1581, in Westminster Hall. Calling it a trial stretches the definition of justice to its breaking point. The verdict was predetermined. The question wasn't guilt or innocence, but how to make the execution serve as the most effective warning to other Catholics. The prosecution's case rested entirely on Campion's religious activities. They claimed he had come to England to withdraw subjects from their allegiance to the Queen. The evidence: he had said Mass. He had heard confessions. He had converted Protestants to Catholicism. In the twisted logic of Elizabethan law, these spiritual acts were high treason. Campion's defense was eloquent but futile. He argued he had never discussed politics, never plotted against the Queen, never encouraged rebellion. His mission was saving souls, not toppling thrones. He even offered to swear an oath of allegiance to Elizabeth in all temporal matters. The court wasn't interested in such distinctions. They needed a dead traitor, not a living loyal subject who happened to be Catholic. The most damning evidence was Campion's own writing. His brag was read aloud as proof of sedition, though it explicitly stated his non-political intentions. The prosecution twisted every word. When Campion wrote about bringing light to those in darkness, they claimed he meant overthrowing Protestant rule. When he mentioned the ancient faith of England, they heard calls for Spanish invasion. Witnesses against him included men who had been tortured on the rack until they agreed to testify. Their stories contradicted each other, dates didn't match, locations were impossibly far apart. None of it mattered. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty of high treason. The sentence, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The method of execution prescribed for traitors in Tudor England represented the absolute pinnacle of legally sanctioned brutality. Modern audiences who think they understand historical violence because they've watched graphic television shows have no conception of what hanged, drawn, and quartered actually entailed. This wasn't death. This was death multiplied by engineering, stretched across time, designed by people who understood exactly how much agony a human body could endure while remaining conscious. First came the hanging, not the quick drop and broken neck of later centuries. Traitors were slowly strangled on a short rope. The victim was hauled up just high enough that their toes scraped the ground. Death by hanging can take up to 20 minutes when done this way. The body convulses, the face turns purple then black, the eyes bulge until blood vessels burst. But they didn't let you die. Not yet. The executioner watched for the exact moment when consciousness started to fade. Then they cut you down. Still alive. Barely, but alive enough for what came next. While you gasped on the scaffold trying to force air through your crushed windpipe, they stripped you naked. The crowd could see everything, your terror, your helplessness, your basic human vulnerability. Then began the drawing. With the victim conscious but unable to resist, the executioner made an incision from sternum to groin. Not deep enough to kill quickly, just enough to open the body cavity. The intestines were pulled out slowly, carefully, making sure not to sever major arteries that would cause rapid death. Witnesses describe victims watching their own entrails being unwound, fully aware of what was happening. The pudenda were severed next and thrown into a fire before the victim's eyes. The psychological torture of this mutilation was considered as important as the physical agony. Then came the extraction of other organs. The executioner was skilled enough to remove organs while keeping the victim alive. Heart and lungs were left till last. Some accounts describe victims remaining conscious until their hearts were literally cut out. Only after all this came the beheading. By this point, death was a mercy. But the humiliation continued. The body was quartered, chopped into 4 pieces with an axe. These pieces, along with the head, were parboiled in salt water and. The morning of December 1, 1581 started with frost covering the muddy streets of London. Edmund Campion woke in his cell knowing exactly what awaited him. 3 days earlier, the verdict had come down, guilty of high treason. The sentence, the full barbaric spectacle reserved for traitors, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Tyburn's triple tree gallows stood waiting, already drawing crowds by dawn. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Servants snuck away from their duties. By 9 o'clock, thousands packed the execution ground. Some came for entertainment. Others secretly prayed for the condemned priest. They dragged Campion through the streets on a wicker hurdle, the traditional transport for traitors. His body, already broken from months of torture in the tower, bounced against the wooden slats with each pothole. Blood seeped through his rough prisoner's clothes where iron shackles had worn his wrists raw. The crowd's noise hit like a physical force as they reached Tyburn. Jeers mixed with hidden prayers. Protestant preachers shouted condemnations while Catholic sympathizers wept behind their hands. Government agents moved through the masses watching for signs of papist sympathy. Campion struggled to stand when they pulled him from the hurdle. His legs, stretched repeatedly on the rack, barely held his weight. Yet witnesses reported something extraordinary. The man smiled. Not the manic grin of madness, but what one observer called the peaceful countenance of one meeting an old friend. They offered him one final chance. Renounce your faith. Accept the Queen's supremacy over the Church. Live. His response carried across the silent crowd. "I die a faithful Catholic." The executioner placed the noose around his neck. Protocol demanded he be hanged just long enough to feel death approaching, conscious for what came next. As they hauled him up, his lips moved in silent prayer. Some swore they heard him whisper forgiveness for his executioners. 20 seconds. 30. His face turned purple, eyes bulging. Then they cut him down, still breathing, still aware. What followed would test even the strongest stomachs in that bloodthirsty crowd. Contemporary accounts paint a scene of barely controlled chaos. A young Protestant minister named John Field wrote to his brother that night, hands still shaking, "I came to witness justice done to a traitor. I left having seen something I cannot name." Field described Campion's face as the executioner approached with the blade, not contorted in terror but set in an expression of such profound acceptance that several women fainted dead away. The crowd, usually raucous at such events, fell eerily quiet. When they laid hands upon him for the drawing, Field continued, he spoke clear as a bell, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." Not screamed, mind you, spoken like a man greeting his Savior at the door. A Catholic merchant named Thomas Pound risked his life recording what he witnessed, hiding his account in a wine barrel for decades. His description remains the most detailed. Father Campion's eyes never closed, never looked away. Even as the executioner did his terrible work, the priest's gaze remained fixed on heaven. Blood ran in rivers, yet his lips kept forming those holy words. The executioner himself, a hardened man who'd performed hundreds of such sentences, later told a tavern keeper he'd never seen anything like it. Most men beg, curse, or pass out from the pain. This one, he looked right through me, like he saw something beautiful beyond all this horror. Government recorder William Cecil noted clinically, the prisoner maintained consciousness throughout the prescribed punishment. No confession of treason obtained despite maximum application of justice. But between those official lines, witnesses saw something else. A Flemish merchant wrote home, "The English say he was a traitor, but I saw a saint made martyr. His blood fell on my boots and I dare not wash it off." Elizabeth Throckmorton, secretly Catholic, watched from a window overlooking Tyburn. Years later, she testified, "When they held up his heart to the crowd, behold the heart of a traitor, no cheer went up, only silence, heavy as a tombstone. That silence spoke volumes." London had seen countless executions. Criminals, traitors, heretics, all met their ends to public approval. But Campion's death felt different. The crowd dispersed quickly, unusually subdued. No one fought for souvenirs of clothing or hair as typically happened. They simply melted away, each carrying their own interpretation of what they'd witnessed. Within hours, the government machinery kicked into overdrive. Lord Burghley issued immediate proclamations. Anyone spreading seditious rumors about miraculous occurrences at the execution faced arrest. Guards posted at Catholic houses. Known papist sympathizers found themselves under renewed surveillance. The official line came swift and harsh. Edmund Campion died a traitor's death, justly executed for plotting against Her Majesty. Any suggestion otherwise constituted treason itself. But proclamations couldn't stop whispers. In Catholic safehouses across England, Campion's name became a rallying cry. They passed around snippets of his final speech, copies of his written defenses, descriptions of his peaceful death. Each retelling grew more reverent. They thought killing him would end it, wrote Catholic nobleman Henry Percy in a coded letter. Instead, they've created something far more dangerous, a martyr whose blood cries out from English soil. Protestant authorities recognized the threat immediately. Sermons denounced papist lies about Campion's holiness. Pamphlets flooded London streets describing him as a Spanish agent, a would-be assassin, a traitor who got what he deserved. Yet even Protestant observers admitted unease. Member of Parliament Francis Knollys wrote in his diary, "The papist priest died well, too well. His composure troubles honest men who witnessed it. We must work twice as hard now to contain the damage." The government's response proved swift and brutal. 3 more priests awaited execution. They would die within the week. Catholic houses faced raids with renewed vigor. Anyone caught with writings about Campion faced imprisonment. But the damage was done. In death, Edmund Campion achieved what he couldn't in life. His execution transformed him from hidden priest to public symbol. Catholics who'd practiced their faith quietly now felt emboldened by his sacrifice. Young men slipped away to seminaries in France and Rome, inspired to follow his path. The Spanish ambassador wrote to Philip II, "The English have handed us a gift. This priest's blood has done more for the Catholic cause than 1,000 sermons." Elizabeth herself reportedly flew into a rage when told of the crowd's subdued reaction. She'd wanted a clear demonstration of justice against traitors. Instead, she got an event that would haunt English Catholicism for generations. The Queen ordered her counselors to double down: more arrests, more executions, more pressure on anyone who dared question the state's religious authority. For English Catholics, December 1st, 1581 became a date etched in collective memory. They marked it in secret, passing down stories of Campion's courage to their children. His name appeared in hidden prayers, coded letters, whispered masses in hidden chambers. The government tried to erase him. They scattered his quartered remains to prevent any shrine forming. They banned his writings, arrested those who spoke his name too reverently. Yet somehow, his influence only grew. Every harsh measure against Catholics now carried the weight of his blood. Every arrested priest became another potential Campion. Protestant England wanted a simple narrative: traitor punished, justice served, order restored. Instead, they created a complexity that would trouble the nation for decades. Campion's execution exposed the raw wound of religious division that no amount of royal proclamations could heal. You need to understand something about Edmund Campion's death. This wasn't about one priest meeting a gruesome end at Tyburn. Elizabeth's government had turned religious persecution into an industrial operation, and Campion was just one product rolling off their assembly line of horror. Between 1570 and 1603, over 130 Catholic priests met the same fate as Campion. That's roughly 4 priests per year being disemboweled alive in front of cheering crowds. The government didn't just execute them, they created an entire infrastructure dedicated to hunting, torturing, and publicly butchering anyone who dared practice the old faith. They had professional priest hunters who earned bounties for every Catholic they captured. These men would infiltrate Catholic safe houses, pretend to seek confession, then drag entire families to the tower. The truly sick part: they made the families watch. When they executed Father Alexander Bryant in 1581, they forced his mother to stand in the front row while they pulled her son's beating heart from his chest. She had to watch as they held it up to the crowd and declared, "Behold the heart of a traitor." The executioner threw it into the fire while it was still pumping blood. Elizabeth's spymaster Francis Walsingham had turned paranoia into policy. His network of informants stretched across England like a spider's web. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Children were rewarded for betraying their parents. One document from 1583 shows the government paid a 12-year-old boy £20 more than most workers earned in a year for revealing where his family heard Mass. The suppression went far beyond executions. Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services faced fines that doubled every month. Miss church for a year: you'd owe more money than your house was worth. The government seized over 5,000 Catholic estates during Elizabeth's reign, transferring wealth from ancient families to Protestant newcomers who supported the regime. They even regulated death itself. Catholics couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Their bodies were dumped in pits outside city walls, mixed with animal carcasses and refuse. When Lady Dorothy Arundel died in 1585, her Protestant neighbors prevented her Catholic funeral. Her body rotted in her house for 3 weeks while lawyers argued over whether reading Latin prayers constituted treason. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical. Catholic parents faced an impossible choice: raise their children in the faith and risk execution, or watch their family's centuries-old traditions die with them. The government created a generation of spiritual orphans, children who grew up terrified to pray the way their grandparents had. This systematic destruction of English Catholicism makes Nazi Germany's early restrictions on Jews look amateur by comparison. At least the Nazis initially allowed private worship. Elizabeth's regime invaded the human soul itself, demanding not just obedience but genuine conversion. They wanted Catholics to doesn't just stop practicing, they wanted them to betray everything their ancestors believed. The government justified this brutality through propaganda so effective that historians still repeat it today. Every Catholic became a potential assassin, every prayer meeting was a conspiracy, every priest was a foreign agent. They transformed an entire religion into an enemy of the state, and they did it so thoroughly that even now, over 400 years later, most people believe Catholics actually were plotting to destroy England. Which brings us to the lies they told about Edmund Campion. The charges against him reveal more about Elizabeth's propaganda machine than any actual Catholic conspiracy. According to government records, Campion supposedly organized assassination attempts, coordinated with Spanish invasion forces, and stockpiled weapons for a Catholic uprising. The evidence: a prayer book and some rosary beads. The trial transcripts are a masterclass in manufactured guilt. Prosecution witnesses claimed Campion discussed overthrowing the Queen during confessions. Conversations that conveniently no one else could verify since they were supposedly protected by sacred seal. One witness, Anthony Mundy, later admitted in private letters that government agents coached him on what to say. They gave him a script and threatened his family if he deviated from it. Here's what the government didn't want you to know. Their own spies reported that Campion actively discouraged political resistance. Multiple intelligence reports from 1580 describe him telling Catholics to suffer patiently and render unto Caesar. He forbade his followers from even discussing politics during religious gatherings. The man they painted as a terrorist was actually preaching peaceful submission. The Campion's bragg document they used to convict him, they edited it. The original text explicitly stated he came to England not to meddle in any matter of state. The version presented at trial mysteriously omitted that line. They literally rewrote his words to justify his execution. Even more damning, the government's star witness against Campion was George Eliot, a man they'd already convicted of theft, forgery, and perjury in 3 separate cases. This was their credible source, a professional criminal whose testimony they bought with a pardon and £50. Court records show Eliot couldn't even keep his story straight during the trial, contradicting himself 6 times about basic facts. The Spanish connection they claimed Campion had? Complete fabrication. Spanish diplomatic archives, which weren't open to scholars until the 1890s, contain 0 mention of Campion. Not a single letter, report, or reference. The Spanish barely knew English Catholics existed, much less coordinated with them. Philip II's advisors actually complained that English Catholic refugees in Spain were troublesome beggars who wouldn't stop asking for money. The weapons cache Campion supposedly maintained, when government agents finally raided the safe houses he'd visited, they found communion wafers and wine. That's it. No guns, no gunpowder, no mysterious foreign gold, just the basic supplies needed to celebrate Mass. They presented these religious items at trial as seditious materials. The propaganda worked so well that even modern historians sometimes repeat these accusations as fact. Textbooks still describe Campion as accused of treason without mentioning that the accusations were fantasy. They've turned Elizabeth's lies into historical truth through sheer repetition. The real tragedy? We'll never know how many innocent people died believing these fabrications. How many Catholics betrayed friends and family because they genuinely thought they were preventing assassinations. How many Protestant witnesses sent priests to their deaths thinking they were saving England from invasion. The government's propaganda didn't just justify murder, it made ordinary people complicit in it. That's the genius of Elizabeth's system. She didn't need to prove Catholics were traitors. She just needed to repeat the lie often enough that everyone believed it. And 400 years later, her propaganda still shapes how we remember Edmund Campion, not as a peaceful priest ministering to hidden congregations, but as a shadowy figure in a conspiracy that never existed.